Good evening and welcome to our first community conversation of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. I'm the Reverend Mary Margaret Earle. I'm the Executive Director and Senior Minister of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry in Roxbury, and I'm so happy to welcome you here this evening. Our community conversations were born out of necessity. As you know, if you know us, we often have gatherings in our historic Meetinghouse. We bring together people for concerts and panel discussions and presentations. But when the pandemic hit us, we couldn't do that anymore. And so we decided to find another way to bring us together in community. And so we're gathering in this virtual way to keep the conversation going.
And the content of our community conversations over the next few months will focus on race, equity, education, history, and Roxbury. It is our hope to raise awareness, to shift our thinking, and provide a space for people to learn and grow. My name is Monique Marshall-Veal, and I am the Director of Special Projects at the Urban Ministry, and we sincerely thank you for joining us tonight.
So tonight we are going to we're going to share a commercial that we made, a homemade commercial. And each community conversation that we have, we're going to share something about a business in Roxbury. Tonight, I'm so pleased that we're going to tell you a little bit about our partner organization, Haley House Bakery Cafe, which is a wonderful eatery in Nubian Square. After that, we're going to have a message from our sponsor. Each month, we'll have a sponsoring organization. And then we'll move on to the main event, a wonderful presentation and discussion with historian Byron Rushing. And now I'd like to share a commercial about our partner, Haley House.
Welcome to Haley House. My name is Misha. Come on in. Our mission is food with a purpose. We offer foods from all over the world. So we have chapati, sambusas, lots of favorites from our chefs, many of which are from the African continent as well as different places in the diaspora. So you can visit us at 12 Dade Street, right in the heart of Nubian Square. If you're not able to make it by, we'll definitely miss you, but you can also find gift cards, retail products, and ground coffee right online. We also do delivery, takeout, and patio service during the spring and summer.
Awesome. And Monique, do you want to introduce our next segment?
Sure. As you said earlier, Mary Margaret, there are several folks who are looking to our organization for involvement, support, and it's very important for our member congregations to have sponsorship. And tonight we have the opportunity to have the First Church in Belmont, Unitarian Universalist, led by Reverend Chris Jablonski, to be the sponsor of tonight's very first community conversations. Many thanks to our member congregations who will support these community conversations over the next few months. Thank you. And now a word from our sponsor.
Hi, my name is Chris Holton Jablonski, and it is my great joy and my deep honor to be the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Belmont, First Church. We're so excited to be the inaugural sponsoring congregation for today's talk. So grateful to Representative Byron Rushing for all that he's sharing today. So excited for Haley House. My sons and I have an order of chicken and waffles coming later this week, which we've been talking about quite a bit. Mostly so grateful for the urban ministry in this moment where so many voices want to convince us that we are so far apart, that we are irreparably divided. I'm grateful for the work of the urban ministry, reminding us that even in the hardest of times, that there is a way forward and a way through. We're deeply honored at First Church here in Belmont to be able to be a small part of the wonderful work of the urban ministry, and so excited for these many years to come, finding more ways to remember this connection and to help serve this hurting world. So thank you, and thanks so much for coming today.
Many thanks again to First Church in Belmont for their support. Thank you for once again being trailblazers. We appreciate it.
And now the main event, Monique.
Yes, thank you. So we have the honor of having, as I would say, Mr. Byron Rushing with us this evening for our first community conversation. And I am honored to be able to share in his introduction. Mr. Byron, as I will address him, is a historian and former state representative. He was born in New York City and has lived in Boston since 1964. During the 1960s, he was active in the civil rights movement, working for the Congress of Racial Equality, in Syracuse, New York, and as a community organizer for the Northern Student Movement in Boston. He directed a group of organizers called the Roxbury Associates, who helped found the Lower Roxbury Community Corporation, which is now known to us as Madison Park Community Development. And it's one of the first CDCs in the nation, and who began some of the earliest organizing in a Black community against the war in Vietnam. As an active Episcopalian, Byron has been a long-time elected lay deputy to its General Convention. Since 2015, he has served as a vice president of its House of Deputies, the highest elected position held by a layperson in the Episcopal Church. Byron is a deeply knowledgeable historian, and from 1972 to 1985, he was president of the Museum of Afro-American History. Under his direction, the Museum of Afro-American History purchased and began the restoration of the African Meetinghouse, the oldest extant Black church building in the United States.
In 1979, Byron oversaw the lobbying effort in Congress to establish the Boston African American National Historical Site, a component of the National Park Service. Byron led the museum in the study of the history of Roxbury. As a legislator, he sponsored the creation of Roxbury Heritage State Park. Byron served more than 35 years in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, beginning in 1982, and served as House Majority Whip. His priorities in the legislature were human and civil rights and the development of democracy, local human, economic, and housing development, and housing and healthcare for all. Byron was an original sponsor of the Gay Rights Bill and the chief sponsor of the law to end discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in public schools. He was one of the leaders in the Constitutional Convention to maintain same-sex marriage in Massachusetts, and successfully co-sponsored the transgender civil rights bill. He has fought for the rights of those who are homeless, fought for victims of violence, and for those struggling with addiction, and fought against reestablishment of the death penalty. During all his time in Boston, he has continued to serve the community with an understanding of the history of poor and working class people, and with a belief in democratic citizen control. He also is, I'm proud to say, a past board member of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry, and he currently serves on the Roxbury Historical Society. He is truly one of the giants who's still walking among us, and I'm so honored that he is our first presenter in our community conversations. Welcome, Byron.
Thank you very much. It is so good to be with you all this evening. I just checked for a minute the participant list, so it's nice to be able to be talking to so many friends and people, other activists who worked with me on many of the projects that you just mentioned. But I'm mostly so pleased to see all the names I don't know, and to know that there are people with from all over who are so interested in the work that you are doing here in Roxbury. So let's go. First question, Mary Margaret.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Byron. So I wanted to start off just talking about how it is that you came to learn so much about the building that our community still calls First Church Roxbury. So much of your work has been about standing against racism, standing against oppression, but unlike the African Meetinghouse that you've been very involved with, the history of First Church is rooted in a Puritan congregation of predominantly white people. So I'd love for you to tell us about how you came to know so much about it and why. What drew you to First Church in Roxbury?
So let me begin by talking about coming to Boston as a community organizer. And as you know, community organizers are supposed to be listening to people and trying to figure out ways to help them accomplish the goals that they talk about. But what in my conversations with people, so often that we came back to questions just about the people's neighborhoods that they had moved into, mainly because they had friends here or other acquaintances here, and had learned very little. There was very few places teaching them about what this neighborhood was all about. And it's as a matter of fact, it's what got me interested in history, because I tried to get answers to those questions, and found that it was not going to be easy. But when I answered those questions for people, they were usually pleased, and things started to make sense for them and me. I tell the story, and it's probably the reason why I went to work to develop the Museum of Afro-American History. I can remember Henry Hampton, who some people on this call knew, and was a resident for a long time in Highland Park, who most people will probably recognize the name if they ever have seen Eyes on the Prize, that great democracy documentary about the civil rights movement. So Henry produced Eyes on the Prize. He was a resident here in Roxbury, and we were sitting together once, and he said, you know, we really should do something about Black history. And I just heard that there's this building for sale, that there actually, that what might be the oldest Black church building is for sale. I think we should buy it, he says. And that was the beginning. And we raised money for the African Meetinghouse, which of course is on Beacon Hill and on the north slope of Beacon Hill. And that, of course, is where Black people lived in Boston in the 19th century. And one of the things I did at the museum, one of the educational programs we introduced was a walking tour of Beacon Hill. And it became very popular. And many schools organized trips by their students to come on these walking tours. And I remember one walking tour, I don't remember the school, I think it might have been a class from the Ellis. And we went around, and the kids were the usual kind of kids. Some of them were distracted by where you could buy ice cream, and some of them listened to what I was saying. But there was one boy who was not distracted, but never asked a question. And when we were all finished, he asked me what became clear was his most important historic question. And he asked me, why is Roxbury called Roxbury? And so I had done all this Black history, right? But he figured it out, that if I knew that, I just might know a question that he probably had been asking most of his short life of 7 or 8, right? You know, he was about 10 years old and probably had asked everybody, why is Roxbury called Roxbury? And it's those combinations actually that brings me to with my interest in Roxbury. So my interest in Roxbury comes from the fact that it became the center of the Black community in Boston. But as the center of the Black community in Boston, it was a place that Black people moved into that had already been built up. So Black people were not coming to Roxbury and building houses. They were coming to Roxbury and renting houses or buying houses. They were coming into another people's architecture. They had left their architecture on Beacon Hill and moved to this architecture, this geography at Roxbury. And they and I was always interested in the fact of their questions, because their questions related to the fact that they wanted to know where they were. They wanted to know what was the physical space. Why was Roxbury the way it was? Right? That they had, in a way, a far more openness to knowing about white people than white people had about knowing about Black people. That it seemed to them just natural to know about where they were, no matter who the ethnic group or race was that was there before them. And so so I very soon at the museum began doing two histories, doing the history of African Americans in Boston, but also at every opportunity we could, doing the history of neighborhoods in Roxbury. And so that is certainly why I found out, because you can't do Roxbury history without doing the first church. For those, and for those people who have actually not walked this ground or read this history, there is no institution in Roxbury as old as the first church, Roxbury, that is sitting on the same ground it's always sat on. That you have the buildings that we're seeing in these pictures are the buildings of the fifth Meetinghouse built, right? And so the first Meetinghouse was built in 1632, but they were always in this same plot of land. They moved a little bit, but never very far. And so you have on this land a kind of space that you sometimes wonder, what if there was one person who lived there and never died? What would be all the stories that person could tell about the neighborhood that grew up around this space? And that is my fascination with this building. It is that it's been there, and how fascinating it is that we can go and try to find what it was like for all the people who are around it. Now, of course, the first people who were around it, when they got here, of course, when the Puritans got here, they were not surprised that there were people living here already. They knew that before they left England, right? And there had been interaction, a little bit of interaction between the English and native people on the shores of New England, going back at least 100 years before the Puritans ever arrived. And that had tragic consequences, as well as that communication that happened. But so when the Puritans come, they know that they look for ways that they can use the geography that the Native Americans had already altered when in developing their town here. So all the main roads that Roxbury, the Puritans laid out, made wider, were all there already. There were already roads and paths that Native Americans were using. Roxbury Street, right? So Native Americans had been coming to where the first church is now for at least 800 years, and probably over 1,000. had been coming and using this space. Now we learn about that from archaeologists. Now we don't have an oral record of that unfortunately we don't have an oral record of that that we can listen to. And we see in the people who grew up around the Meetinghouse for the first, what? That would be 100. 100 years is 1730. 200 years is 1830. So for the people who grew up around this place were engaged in this huge political struggle. And that was the struggle of being a colonist, right? Mm-hmm. And then the struggle of trying to be independent of the mother country. And it all happened around this space. Mm-hmm. So as we were talking a little while ago, one of the reasons why you have the building that you have there is the fourth Meetinghouse was taken down so that they could build this Meetinghouse,
which is the one on behind you,
right? And actually, right? You can see that in this painting that's behind me, and it might have been taken down because it was damaged during the American Revolution, because Roxbury was the closest place you could be to the British lines, so closest place to Boston, and people were fighting, they were killing each other, and they were bombarding each other with their cannons. So a lot of buildings were damaged, and so that makes a lot of sense that's why this building was taken down. And it lives then through the 19th century, which for the people who organized this congregation must have seemed like the world was turning upside down. Mm-hmm. There are lots of ways of explaining how insular Puritans were, but one of the things they did not like were other Christians, and since the town could choose what other churches could come into the town, they decided that they didn't want any churches except Puritan churches. Well, you guys are the descendants of Puritans. I know you don't like to say that, but and so they built other Puritan churches. So we had a second church Roxbury and a third church Roxbury into Jamaica Plain and out into what is now West Roxbury. But they didn't let any Baptist in until 1810. Right?
Wow.
Right. And so so you get a sense of the 19th century as the period when Roxbury around this building becomes heterogeneous with white people. All different kinds of white people start moving in. And of course, after the Civil War, there's just this burst of European immigration into the United States. And all of those people, they didn't all, but it appears that they all came to Roxbury. So we had Scandinavians, and so you had Lutheran churches, and we had Italians, and of course the Irish, and many other ethnic groups here trying to figure out how to live together. And then you have another big transformation in the neighborhood, and that is when the Black population of Boston begins to increase in the 20th century, and they are looking for places to live. They have to then depend on places where the owners of the property are willing to rent to them and are willing to sell to them, and that is, of course, is a conversation that leads right up to the present day. And two of those neighborhoods was Roxbury and the South End, and Black people from here. They moved from Beacon Hill here, but most of them are coming to Boston for the first time and move here instead of trying to live on Beacon Hill. So does that answer some of your question?
It does. It does.
Thank you.
I want to give Monique a chance to ask a question.
Sure. Thank you. So thank you, Byron, for sharing your journey to Roxbury and kind of the interest that you have in Roxbury and being a community organizer. Your work still remains in this community, and it will for a very long time. So thinking about that. And just listening a little bit over what you were saying and thinking about, how the neighborhood has changed. Can you talk a little bit about what the evolution of the neighborhood has been over the past 100 years and kind of how you would describe what it looks like today for us?
That's
So
a great question.
Two-part question, but
Right.
yeah.
That's a great question. And although we probably won't have a real opportunity to do this, we have to figure out a way, because there are a lot of people on this phone call that on the Zoom meeting that should spend a lot of time talking about this with their friends. They need to be telling, they know they would live through it, and they need to be telling this story to their non-friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. So I'll tell my view of it. So when I come to Roxbury in 1964 to work, as I said, as a community organizer. At that time, the major concern for people were the accessibility to decent housing,
Mhm.
and then the other concern that people had was just this strong feeling that there was no support for the Black community coming from city government.
Mm.
And that usually took the form of sort of trying to figure out how do I get my landlord to fix up my apartment,
Mm.
right? Because most of the people were renters, right? And then the other thing that came up a lot was some employment. How come I can't get jobs that are sponsored by the government, right? So how come I can't be a police person or a fireman, right? How come I apply and can't do that? And even trying to be a school teacher, you get the sense that they have a limit on how many Black teachers they want to have at any one time. And so, but the most obvious way that people, and almost all of them, complained about city government was getting the streets cleaned.
Hmm.
That at how little attention was paid to cleaning Roxbury, to even picking up the garbage on a regular basis, and that over and over that became a complaint. So I'm one of my so I, like most community organizers, I have to always tell my head, no, you can't go and do what you want to do. And you do what people ask for. And I can remember going door to door in Lower Roxbury and actually being surprised that the whole question of housing was sort of second or third on the list. But what was number one was, and there was a Madison Park in those days in Lower Roxbury. It was a large square in the middle of Lower Roxbury called Madison Park, and it was filthy. Public park, and it was filthy. Hardly ever cleaned up by the city of Boston, and adults and children complained to me about it. And so one of the first things we organized was a campaign to get the city to clean up Madison Park. It's another story. It was a lot of fun, though. We cleaned up a section of it and piled it into a big pile to give this to be able to take pictures of how dirty it really was by piling all the refuse up. And you had a situation then where people from the suburbs would literally try to avoid their own town dumping fees by driving on to work and coming by Madison Park and dumping their garbage. And so you had all of that craziness going on. And so we built this big big pile of garbage and decide to set it on. The kids decide to set it on fire. The adults start groaning about that. But then I'm a community organizer, so I said, go for it, set it on fire. Fortunately, of course, we told everybody we were going to do this. We are going to be there and do it. The photographers from the newspapers were there, and they take pictures of this. And then they take pictures of the firemen hosing down the people after they put out the fire, right?
Wow.
And that gets on the front page of the newspaper the next day, right? And the whole thing changes, right? So the Mayor Collins is completely embarrassed, and they clean up the park. And so but that's, I say all of that to talk about the nature of the neighborhood. Now, the neighborhood at the same time had a significant number of middle-class people in it, but the middle-class people in Roxbury were beginning to leave because more and more housing was being available to them in the suburbs. And so you had this movement at the same time that you had Black people coming into Roxbury. You had this movement of middle-class people away from Roxbury, and that then caused this whole problem of having a neighborhood that was by in percentage becoming poorer and poorer. The city's response to that is to attempt to fix up a piece of it. And they do that through a program that's available then called Urban Renewal. And a good deal of Roxbury was improved and repaired by Urban Renewal. And it is the first time that other than the building of public housing, that there's any new housing built in Roxbury. For places in up around what is now Malcolm X Park, what used to be Washington Park, and the urban renewal area was called the Washington Park Urban Renewal Area. The places around relatively new housing, it's not very new now, right? But new housing was being built there in the 60s, like Marksdale and Warren Gardens and housing like that was built during that period. Then but the neighborhood is still, the Black population continues to increase. More and more Black people are moving here. And the segregation, as you know, residential segregation in Boston was intense. You literally got to a street on the border of Roxbury. You crossed that street, there were no more Black people. Columbia Road was like that when I came to Boston. When you crossed Columbia Road, you were in white Irish Dorchester. And that density just caused all kinds of anger and fury in the neighborhood, and that fury would break out at times. In 1967, there were riots in Grove Hall, and then in 1968. There was after a real concern, after there were riots after Martin Luther King's assassination throughout the country, that Boston would again have riots. The city finally decided that they would do something. And what they decided to do was literally give more land, give more space for Black people to live. And they did this in the context of their understanding that the city had to stay residentially segregated. So they designated a piece of a neighborhood south of Roxbury, along Blue Hill Avenue, past Franklin Park and Franklin Field. And they literally drew a map and drew a line around it and worked out a deal with all the bankers in Boston that they would give mortgages to Black people in that area. Right? I mean, if you want to get a sense, I mean, just think about this, about how horrible and racist the leadership, and these are leaders that have gotten their reputations cleaned up. They need to get uncleaned. Right? Their idea was, it never dawned on them that they could just say to the banks, give mortgages to Black people for any property they can afford anywhere it is in the city.
Yeah.
1968, they could not do that.
Yeah.
And so they had what people called, it had a name, and everybody called it by, Black people called it by its initials, and that was BBURG. It was the Boston Banks Urban Renewal Group.
Mm.
And so everybody, and that is how Black people got to Mattapan. Right?
Mm.
And that's how, and eventually, of course, there was a major shift in the Black population in Boston, and most Black people in Boston don't live in Roxbury anymore. They live in other neighborhoods now, but most of the traditional older Black institutions stayed in Roxbury. So Black people now come to those institutions. They drive from Mattapan to those institutions instead of walking around the block to those institutions, and especially the Black churches.
Mm. So
when I came to Highland Park, Black people were trying to figure out, how do you get parts of Roxbury improved, right? Just like we were working in Lower Roxbury, and eventually we were able to build new housing in Lower Roxbury. People came to, Black activists came to the Highland Park neighborhood around First Church and started to work to make sure that there was more permanent housing in that neighborhood for low income and moderate income Black people. And the major organization that did that in Highland Park was called RAP, Roxbury Action Program. And Roxbury Action Program had begun as an organization on Blue Hill Avenue, and they decided that that there were parts of Roxbury that this organizing was not going on, and they made a decision to move. And so they moved over to Linwood Street and did a tremendous amount of work in stabilizing the Highland Park neighborhood for people of color.
So Byron, in the midst of all this, First Church Roxbury is there, right? I mean, First Church is still there. And so one of the things that
I've said this to you many times, and I will say it here now publicly. I go back and forth trying to figure out how did First Church sort of stay there and not be connected to people in the neighborhood. And the only answer I can come up with is aesthetics. I think the Black people who lived around First Church liked the way it looked. Mm-hmm. Right? They would complain about it. They would complain about when there was a time when the fence was when the building was not in use, the gates were locked. Right? Black people complained about that all the time. I think I wasn't part of this, but I think they did have meetings with the leadership of First Church about keeping the gates open. Mm-hmm. But for a church painted white, it got in, and it just got such a little bit of graffiti. It was hardly ever, you hardly ever walked by and saw anybody have painted on it. And this was a time when Black people like to paint on things. So a lot of people who are in Highland Park remember the Black of the statue of Jesus that was up on Highland Park. They got painted black, right? Fortunately, that was a Roman Catholic institution at the time. Fortunately, the nuns who were there said, "Oh, we don't have any problem with Black Jesuses," and so that stayed, right? But so I think that people were amazingly patient with the white people at First Church for that reason. Now there certainly would be arguments. There was but I want to put and because this is a really important criticism, and an important criticism of Unitarians. At most churches, in most Black churches in Roxbury, are in buildings where the white congregation that was there before, right, didn't want to be there anymore. So they sold the buildings, right? So if you go to Charles Street Church, right? That African Methodist Episcopal Church had existed on Beacon Hill. They come to Roxbury and they buy a building, and that a congregation moves into the building. And you can say that for literally dozens of Black church buildings. But then there was a minority, and those were the white congregations that decided to stay and figure out a way to invite the people who were moving into the neighborhood to be part of their congregations. And that would be Resurrection Lutheran, or the Presbyterian Church up on Blue Hill Avenue. Those were examples of that. But that was not the predominant way that Black churches got established in Roxbury. And the Unitarians had a chance, right? They could have just simply said, if there's anybody, right, who is interested in, what do you guys call it, liberal religion, our doors are open. You should come. We'll leaflet the neighborhood, right, and say, come when our services are. And the congregation just couldn't deal with that.
That's what I wondered. Yeah, that's one of the things that I wondered, Byron. Since I came to the urban ministry, I've heard different stories about, as you know, about 17 years ago, the First Church Roxbury merged with the UU Urban Ministry. Right. And so the urban ministry began operating programs out there. And about 17 years fully moved our operations to that campus. But since I arrived, I've heard different stories about, how welcome or not welcome the community, the Black community felt in that space, and whether the fence appeared to be keeping people out, whether people felt welcome. And I'm really curious about what you think about that question, about how people felt welcome or not.
There were exceptions to this by the congregation, but certainly for the fence, it was the gates. And then they did change their mind about that and open the gates so that the gates would be open every day and open when there was no one using the church. But there was no ongoing invitation to do what the white people were doing in those buildings, in the building. Right? It was that was separate. There was one interesting exception, and that is there was a large library in Highland Park for a number of years, and then they started to go they started to go out of business. It was called Fellows Athenaeum, and I think the building still stands, or part of it anyway, on Millmont Street. But when they decided that they couldn't keep the building up and sold the building, they still were trying to figure out what to do with their institution, which was heavily endowed. And they decided to move the library into Putnam Chapel. So in the 1960s, there was a library on the upper floor of Putnam Chapel, and there was a little stereotypic white librarian, but she was wonderful. She bought books about Black people, right? And so there was this sort of one place that was sort of open, like 5 days a week on your campus. They, of course, but the church didn't urge them to stay, which was a mistake. You would have had a little bit more money if you had done that. But the BPL did, and so they ended up merging their endowment with the Boston Public Library, and those funds are used for the Roxbury branch of the Boston Public Library, right? But so I think that I think that staying is so important, right? They could have left, right? And they could have sold it to a Black congregation, right? And so and so staying, I think, was for whatever reason was of course the right decision. And then of course more and more the activists and liberals in the Unitarian and Universalist Church became interested in the space and saw the potential for the space. We shouldn't tell this. We shouldn't leave this history without saying that you did make one attempt to have a Unitarian Universalist minister, correct?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And that was
Tom Paine.
Tom Paine, right? Yeah, and he worked at it, but it was.
Yeah.
I used to tell him, just don't tell people that Jesus. If you want Black Unitarians, you got to adjust your talk about Jesus, right? You know, you invite the people from King's Chapel to come up. You know. So.
Byron, can I ask a question, just kind of following up with what Mary Margaret was starting to talk about, just around, you know, the urban ministry inherited the campus that they have in Roxbury, and you have studied and have been witness to a lot of the changes that have happened, a lot of the folks who've come to visit, why they're coming to visit, the story behind the gates, even the library, which was new information to me. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, how the urban ministry can really, you know, partner with Roxbury, serve Roxbury, whatever the words are that we want to use at this particular time? And what do you think that we can do to make sure that people see the urban ministry as a place that is welcoming and that is open to working with the community of Roxbury?
Well, I think in the way you asked that question, you actually answered it, and it really is. I mean, I think you need to always see your presence as an advantage for the community, because the community saw it as an advantage when you weren't doing anything. See, they thought the building they saw as an advantage. You know, I mean, you know, there not many. We don't have a lot of public buildings in Roxbury that have nicknames, and when you say their nickname, everybody knows what you're talking about. And you might not like your nickname, but the big white. You got to live with the big white church. And when you say the big white church, people all over Roxbury, it's not just Highland folk, they know what you're talking about. Isn't that remarkable, right? And so you have to build on the knowledge that people have already. And it is exactly what you said, Monique. It is really listening. So and just like you do, just like this conversation, you just have to talk to people. That's all it is. It's just talking to people, right? And just and you know, and listen and take deep, long breaths. Hold your breath for as long as you can before you answer. Don't worry about answering, right? Worry about listening. And there's just such a remarkable amount of advice and storytelling and history that will just aid you in making, you know, what we call, you know, strategic decisions about your future. But you have said one thing to people that I think everybody has heard, and that is, you're not going anywhere. You don't invest in a space like this and go somewhere, right? So people weren't sure what was going to happen in the 60s, but I don't think there's anybody in Roxbury that thinks you're getting ready to move.
No.
And I think, and so I say, build on all of that. Listen to people, right? I know it'll be a while before you say put big white church on your stationery, but I just saw a notice for a meeting that said it was weird.
Poor People's Campaign, yeah.
Poor People's Campaign just put up a notice and said they were going to be at the big white church, and they didn't have to put an address.
People knew who we were.
Thank you.
But I do think it's listening. I think people really appreciate the fact that you've been around so long. I think they, you know, and because you also are saying something that when Black people in Roxbury talk about their history, Black people who are literally generations away from this happening, Black people will say, well, we used to be in Beacon Hill. And so that's a physical place in Boston that has hardly any Black people in it now, right? But that they can say we were there, right? We were there, and they can go and look at it, right? But they're also in Roxbury, and in Roxbury they can say we live, as some people like to say, we live in the physical center of Boston, right? We live, but they all say we live in Roxbury, and Roxbury is old. Roxbury used to be a city, right? And take advantage of that, right? Because people will come and talk to you because of.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to just tell us that our hidden moderator just sent us a reminder that we have 5 more minutes, and then we want to leave time for Q&A. So there's a lot more we want to ask you. Monique, do you want to tee up the last question, and then after Byron responds, then we'll turn it over to Q&A?
Sure, absolutely. So Byron, in thinking about all of our freedom fighters who have left a legacy of activism, fighting for social justice, fighting against racism, and I think about Mimi Jones and I think about John Lewis. And John Lewis left us with very clear instructions, telling us all to get into good trouble. And thinking about good trouble and thinking about the generation today, and so many of us, given the climate of our country right now, what would you tell us would be the good trouble the urban ministry should actually get into?
Yeah. And so, I think that's a great question. And on one hand, you have to answer that. You have to answer that. And I think, but from the references that you just made, is, part of listening, was Mimi Jones came. So Mimi Jones is living in our neighborhood, and even for me, I would talk to Mimi and she'd say, oh yes, I was in the civil rights movement. And it took me literally over a year before I found out, because I of course knew about St. Augustine, Florida, and the swimming pool, but I'd never put her together with that. It was just like, wow, right? And again, it's making sure that that everyone in the community in Roxbury, and I don't mean just Highland Park, and there's a lot of people, but everybody in Roxbury knows that they want to just sit down and talk about this stuff, right? There are going to be some people listening, right? And the other piece, of course, is John Lewis. John Lewis knows where First Church was, because you invited him. That's the other thing. It's not a bad space to have people from all over the country and activists all over the country and the world be invited to just come. So when they're passing through, to go to Harvard, waylay them and get them over to Roxbury. This is a difficult time for this community, but it's a difficult time for Black people in the country, because I think what Black people are struggling with in Roxbury and in Boston, Black people are struggling with all over this country, and that is to get two things. One is respect, right? Which means that we have to either convert or get rid of all the disrespectful people, right? That's not easy, right? And the other thing is that we need to have a future with equity. We need to have a future with a share of this incredible prosperity that we have in this country, mostly for bad reasons, right? So, we say we're in Roxbury, but we're in the land of the Massachusetts. Right? We say we're in Roxbury, but we're also in a land that where much of the money that people still inherit in New England came from ancestors who engaged in the slave trade. Right? So we have to figure out a way of getting that equity, right, equalized in this country and in our communities. And we have to start locally. And you start locally just by making demands and by agreeing on what your community is going to be like. And Roxbury has to agree that we are going to be a community where no one who is living here feels ever forced out. If they want to choose to leave, if it's a choice, thank you very much for being here. Sorry to see you go, right? But no one in this community should be forced out. Yeah. And that means that as a community, we have to buy into that. We have to buy into housing that is available to everybody. And we have to set rules. And one of those rules is we don't have any problem with rich people, except you cannot come here if one Black person has to move because you came here. And if that happens, we're sorry. We're not going to be your neighbors. We're not going to do anything nasty, but we're just not going to talk to you. That's all. So, if you want to live that way, that's, you have the money, you can buy it. We understand that, right? But you are not welcome here unless you understand that you are coming to a community of people who feel comfortable staying as long as they want.
Thank you, Byron. Thank you for that call about how to respond to some of the displacement that's being caused by gentrification. And I really appreciate your commentary on that. So we want, Byron, this is amazing. It's always amazing to listen to you. And I want to give folks who are in the audience a chance to talk. So there are two ways that you can ask your question. You can raise your hand. There's a way to on your screen to raise your hand, and we can actually unmute you so that you can say your question to Byron. Or if you're more comfortable, but keep in mind, if you're saying your question, we are recording this. We're going to share this. It's going to be on our website. We're going to offer it to other people. So this will be recorded. So you can either raise your hand and speak your question. We won't see your face, but we will hear your voice and Byron can respond. Or you can write your question in the chat box. So while you're thinking of your question, we have about a half an hour to do some Q's and A's. And we're going to first, though, give you a chance to think about it and share our commercial again, featuring our wonderful partner, Haley House in Nubian Square, that has amazing food. We want you to support Haley House. Each community conversation, we're going to be highlighting another business in the community in the hopes that you will financially support them, get a gift card, go eat there, pick up, do some takeout. So here's our commercial again for Haley House, and then we're going to come back to Byron with some questions and answers.
Welcome to Haley House. My name is Misha. Come on in. Our mission is food with a purpose. We offer foods from all over the world. So we have chapati, sambusas, lots of favorites from our chefs, many of which are from the African continent as well as different places in the diaspora. So you can visit us at 12 Dade Street, right in the heart of Nubian Square. If you're not able to make it by, we'll definitely miss you, but you can also find gift cards, retail products, and ground coffee right online. We also do delivery, takeout, and patio service during the spring and summer.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have some questions.
We do. Let's see. First question in the chat. Actually, before I do that, Byron, thank you again so much for being with us. We appreciate the knowledge and wisdom and history that you shared with us. And there were a couple of people in the chat who are awaiting your book, my friend. So
Yeah.
I'm
Waiting
sure
for
that
Byron's
will be
book.
coming soon. So thank you.
Before we do the question, I'll also read one comment. Was Representative Rushing, I've heard you speak before, and what amazes me as much as your encyclopedic memory is how you keep a smile on your face as you describe the good, the bad, and the ugly. A model of equanimity.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right. So do you want to begin with the questions, Monique?
Sure. Our first question comes from Lisa. What should UU congregations do to support the urban ministry now? So what can our member congregations do right now to support the urban ministry?
Oh, to support the urban ministry.
Or the work of the urban
The work
ministry.
of the urban ministry, I would say. Yes.
You know, I've never figured out what Unitarians are on this, but you should all your congregations should tithe 10% to you.
Oh, did you hear that? Did you hear that?
Right.
Maybe I could do a little spin on that and say how could they support the work in Roxbury?
Yeah, right. And because I think that the people with the ability to give, you know, they really have to sit down and decide that they have to give a lot. You know, and it really doesn't, you know, you can't give a little if you really want a significant change to occur. Because we have seen what happens with the philanthropy that is too little. And it actually does two things. One, it just doesn't put enough money into organizations and the community. But the other thing it does, it makes people spend too much of their time asking for the little. Right? And that is a hard thing. You know, I mean, you know, no one wants to ask for money to help themselves and their neighbors, right? They just soon be able to be raising that money themselves, right? To earning that money themselves. And so it is never easy for people, and you should never see it as easy to have people, you know, come out to your church and talk about how terrible things are. Right, you know, that is really awful. You know, as my daughter, my daughter and I were talking about this once. I was complaining about, and you probably have been to meetings of philanthropies where they bring up people that they are helping to tell their story, and so the philanthropy is helping, you know, poor women, and they get an example of a poor woman standing up and saying, I was in this terrible situation and I came here and you helped me, you know, and I was saying how I just find it annoying. I always get up when I was at those events. I used to always get up and thank the people for getting up and doing that, right? And telling them how hard it was. And I can remember that, you know, when I was in similar situation a long time ago. And my daughter reminded me of something, or told me of something I hadn't thought of. She said, no, white people should never do that unless they're willing to stand up and tell their worst stories. Mm-hmm. And if they're not willing to stand up and tell their worst stories, don't ask anybody who deserves all the money you have to tell you their worst stories.
Yeah, thank you.
Because you're not listening.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. I wonder if we can go to one of the people raising their hands so we can hear an out loud question. Here's Candelaria. I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Candelaria, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you first of all for allowing this community conversation to happen, and thank you, Byron, as always, for your wealth of knowledge. I think that you have about 3 manuscripts in you. I think you should do a podcast. I think you should do a video a series of video chats, but a podcast would be wonderful. You're always so magnanimous and you always have so much wisdom. I'm wondering if there's any activist battle you ever lost or something that still frustrates you in the history of your time being in Roxbury, something that you just feel was an incredibly missed opportunity that may illuminate where we are now.
Thank you, Candelaria.
That's a great question. You know, I have a lot. And I think one of the, you can't be a community organizer without having a catalog of losses. Certainly, for me, an immediate one in Roxbury was the development of Washington Street. I think that I think we made that and the gentrification of Washington Street. It's now getting to. It started, of course, in the South End, but it's spread right up into Dudley Square / Nubian Square now, and it really gets traced back to not ever putting in the kind of transportation that street should have had, that was open, that was accessible, easily accessible to everyone. When I came to Roxbury, that neighborhood was called Dudley Station. No one called it Square. They called it Dudley Station because everyone knew that was the place not only that you could congregate, but that you were going to be transported from. And if I had it to do over again, I would never have taken down the L. I would never have taken down the elevated train. I might have taken the trains off, but I would have figured out some other way of keeping that and making sure. And this is so difficult that to plan ahead. We have to expect that things are not going to go well. We have to have our plan B's and C's for every strategy we have. And we should never have started to allow the work to happen on Washington Street until we had commitments on what was going to happen for housing and businesses all along that street that was going to make all of that progress be equitable progress.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I know that we have a couple of questions. I'm thinking we should continue with the folks who want to ask a question out loud. I think we have a question from Ernest.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Good evening, Sister Mary, Margaret, and Monique. And Byron, it's always a pleasure to hear your chats. All the way back from Blue Hill Avenue, I remember having conversations. My question is about the church. So, First Church of Roxbury, inside of the church, there's many plaques of many of the people that were founders of not only the church, but of Boston. And they were shakers and movers in New England, Massachusetts anyway. Is there some way, like one of the families, I think was the Ames family, I guess they made a fortune selling shovels to people that, went to mine gold in California. I guess the people like, I don't know if the Levi family, but people who sold supplies, who built the ships for the different enterprises that we saw as being part of America's development. A lot of that took place in Massachusetts, and Boston was one of the key spots. So is there some role those founding families might want to have with the church, and i.e. then the community that the church is still sitting in? Is there some bridge that you see as a possibility?
I think there are two things about that. One is, and I assume the ministry's development office works on this every day, which is to try to find some living descendants of these people and see if they're interested. And that's a great thing to be doing. But the other thing is, they're an important part of the history of the church, and as you say, the community and the larger community, and we should know about them. You know, I think when I walk around and look at the plaques on the inside of the church, you know, there are only two names that pop up that I always can tell. I know some interesting things about. I'm not talking about John Eliot, because he gets his name all over the place, but one is of course the first minister, Well, and no one should think they know anything about Puritanism if they haven't studied the life of Wells, who of course went back to England and became Cromwell's chaplain, but left a lot of descendants here. Before he left a lot of little Wells in Roxbury. But the other is Dillaway, and you know, who lived across the street and was the educator, and gets his name in the Dillaway Thomas house. But it's be interesting to see how all of those people made their money. You know, that would be, I mean, that would be a good task for telling the history.
Yeah.
You know, I went and because so many times the way that they're described are ways that are too neutral, and you start to worry. So when people say that someone was owned ships and was a merchant, I think you got to ask, where did he go and what did he have what did he carry?
Exactly.
Right. And I think it'd be a great task, a great project. Mary Margaret and Monique are working with young people that they have at history. I think a great piece of that work that they're doing would be to take a look at the people who are on those plaques.
I love that idea.
And their history.
Yeah.
Right? Because we have to. There is nothing wrong with telling the truth. Right? So and the truth can be really hard, but it's better to tell a hard truth than to have people growing up lying.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. So I'm going to go, I know we won't be able to get through all of the questions, but we'll do our best. So I'm going to go to one of the chat box questions.
Mm-hmm.
And from Valerie, there's a question. Byron, do you have a view about how the Boston educational system is adapting to learning during COVID-19?
So let me say that is Candelaria still on? I guess I could have put this on my list. It has probably been the most frustrating institution, public institution to work with, and in my career has been the Boston school system, and I think that what you see happening right now really grows out of just a system that has such a really destructive philosophy, and so then when emergencies occur, there isn't a kind of fallback to how to deal with emergencies in an equitable kind of way. And so this decision, or this non-decision of making a mind of what the system is, what the system of teaching is going to be during this COVID time, and having that be what is put into effect. It is just unconscionable that they have to be delaying what is essentially decision making because they don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. So I have to tell you that I think it's really important. What's more important than getting children to be taught in person, what is more important than any of this, those kinds of pieces, is that children be told by adults what is going to happen. And so what we see is children getting raised, this generation of school children getting raised, understanding that adults don't know what they're doing. And they hear it. They hear it. You know, when they expect to go to school in a week and then that gets canceled, right? You know, and put off, postponed. Yeah. No, I don't know how much we can do. I don't know how much we can do while this is going on, but don't forget any of this when the virus is over. Don't let any of these people off when the virus is over, right? So we have a system that is based on equity with no decision. There is nothing in the school system working to make sure that all children in the public school system are equal and have equity. You know, there was no reason to have to wait for this tragic, right, virus before every school child in the city had decent devices to in their homes, right? Why shouldn't every home be capable of having virtual ability, right? And that should happen, period, right? And so if you work on a system that's based on keeping poor people poor, right? Then it's when you have emergencies like this, you cannot expect anything but disaster, right? So I won't get rid of. I'll let them stay to the end of the year. But I think the major thing to do with the school department is get rid of all the bureaucrats in the school department, right? Right. Everybody that has a desk job in the school department could be a teacher.
Thank you, Byron.
Thank you. All right, so we have a couple more questions, and I think actually this one ties right into the education of young people, which is what would be a good starting point to teach our children about Roxbury's deep history?
Well, if we should be working to make sure that as soon as there's a way to have some influence on the school committee, that all schools in Roxbury teach Roxbury history, and they should teach that Roxbury history all through. It shouldn't be a one-time course. It should be involved in all the work they do, and that probably is true for all school systems. You see, is that all school systems should be involving their local history in all of their teaching, math and science, and obviously history and social studies. And I think we've had schools that have done that in Roxbury, and I think that should be standard for education in Roxbury. So when we make up our list of demands, that has to be one of the demands. And then we have to get as much support for those institutions that are doing that work right now, so that more people are connected with them. One is obviously the Roxbury Historical Society, but there are other institutions like First Church that are doing bits and pieces of this history, and that work needs to be supported, so that people get used to talking about it, and especially young people. So then they also are comfortable in finding places to get the answers.
Okay. Thank you. I think we have time for about one or maybe two more questions. So here's one in the chat from Claire. Are Roxbury residents sufficiently represented in the planning and decisions on new housing in Roxbury? How can improvements be institutionalized?
Well, the short answer is you have to bite the bullet and go to all the meetings. I don't wish that on anybody, but we all have to make sacrifices. So you have to show up when the decisions are being made. Now, but there is a bigger problem, and that is that the system has to be changed, and Roxbury as a community, right? No matter how organized it becomes, right, is always going to be at a disadvantage if it doesn't run the system that includes the building and of decent housing and the regulations around that decent housing. Now, and part of that is that we are not a government. And so people, if people really want to have more security for everybody that lives in Roxbury right now, they have to work on ways of getting more of the authority away from the city government and getting that transferred to their neighborhood. You know, people experimented with this, you know, and in Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative early on, experimented with this by getting the power of eminent domain for their community. And then like a lot of things, once that happened, the city decided they would never do it again for anybody else. All right, we should have the power of eminent domain. Roxbury as a neighborhood should be able to condemn the terrible buildings that we have, but when they're condemned, then they come to the neighborhood. They're owned by the neighborhood and not by the city of Boston. And I think that we need to have more control over zoning. If there are, as long as we allow anything to happen for money, right, then we will always be at risk of being gentrified. And the only way you can stand up against money is by government, right? So you can change the rules, right? And I think we have to have some serious conversations about that. But so immediately, you got to go to the meetings, right? You got to get zoomed to death in the BRA meetings. But going forward, we have to figure out ways of working together to get control of the neighborhood, right?
Thank you. And I think, Mary Margaret, this will be our last question, and it's kind of a good wrap-up question. Byron, you know that people always want to come to the urban ministry. They want to work with us. There are organizations in the community that want to work with us. Where do you think, and this question is actually coming from Chris, where do you think the Roxbury community needs or wants folks to participate in positive ways as we move forward in this decade?
So I think that for the people who are living in Roxbury, they need to be working to be able to control their own community, right? I think that the people who are not living in Roxbury, depending on their neighborhoods, because some of them need to be working to control their neighborhoods where they live in other parts of Boston, or neighborhoods in comparable neighborhoods in other cities. But the people who are living in relatively comfortable middle class neighborhoods, what they need to do is to organize their neighbors to make sure that the people that they have any influence with do the right thing around communities like Roxbury all over. So that means that means that you make sure that you don't elect legislators. If you're in Massachusetts, that you don't elect legislators who don't immediately pledge that they're going to work with the Black and Latino legislators and the legislators of poor and working class communities in Massachusetts from the get-go, from the very beginning. And so you use your influence on those people to support the programs and strategies that are created and run by people of color and other people in poor and working class neighborhoods like Roxbury.
Byron, thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, when we decided we were doing community conversations, it was very easy who the first person we were going to invite to do a community conversation, which was you, because we knew that you would be able to carry it and bring us so much wonderful information. And I'm on behalf of the Urban Ministry, I'm really grateful and very proud that we were able to host you. And I hope that you'll come back and talk again in a future community conversation this year. And I really look forward to when we can do it in person and you can speak from the front of the meeting house to people in person.
Yes.
So thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. It was really good to be with you, Mary Margaret and Monique. And I really appreciate everyone who took the time out to Zoom in with us.
Yes. And tune in, everybody can tune in next month on November 24th. King Boston's Executive Director Amari Paris Jeffries will talk about closing the racial wealth gap in Boston and what we can do about that. So join us next month for that one. Stay tuned. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, good night, good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.